just stop for a second. Imagine you wake up one morning, grab your coffee, and walk outside, only to find that the thing your father built with his own 2 hands, the last piece of him you had left, is now surrounded by a fence. And there's a notice hanging on it that says, "This property is no longer yours." What would you do? Would you scream? Would you fight? Would you fall apart? Mark did none of that. He just smiled and waited 48 hours. And those 48 hours destroyed everything his neighbor had. This story takes place in a small residential community in America, run by something called an HOA, a homeowners association. Think of it like a neighborhood committee that decides how houses should look, what color you can paint them, and what you can or can't build. On paper, it sounds reasonable. But when someone like Richard gets onto that committee, it stops being about the neighborhood and starts being about power. Richard was the kind of man who walked into a room like he owned it, always dressed in a suit, always smiling, but it was the kind of smile that made you feel like he was calculating something behind his eyes. He had been on the HOA committee for years, and somewhere along the way he started confusing authority with ownership. Mark, on the other hand, was the complete opposite, quiet, private. He kept to himself and never looked for trouble. All he wanted was to live peacefully on his property. And on the edge of that property stood a small wooden cabin, old, weathered, but built strong. That cabin meant everything to Mark, because his father had built it himself, plank by plank, nail by nail. Mark's father was gone now, and that cabin was the last piece of him left in the world. Richard had been eyeing that cabin from the very beginning. His own house sat right across from it, and he wanted that space cleared so he could park his 3 cars there. At first, he approached Mark politely with friendly suggestions. "Mark, that cabin looks terrible. It's bringing down the neighborhood." Mark politely refused. Then Richard brought the issue to the HOA meetings. The committee reviewed the case, checked the property codes, and dismissed it because the cabin was completely legal. But Richard didn't stop. Soon, notices began appearing, official-looking letters filled with baseless accusations. Mark responded to every single one calmly, with documentation, property records, and receipts. Every time Richard pushed, Mark quietly proved him wrong. And every time Richard lost, something darker grew inside him. Eventually, Richard made a decision. If the rules wouldn't give him that land, he would just take it. The next morning, Mark stepped outside his home and froze. Iron fencing surrounded the cabin on all 4 sides. Sharp metal spike strips, the kind that destroy car tires, had been placed across the path leading up to it. And attached to the fence was a white notice that read, "This area is under HOA jurisdiction. Unauthorized entry is strictly prohibited." Mark stood there silently for a long moment. The coffee in his hand slowly went cold. His mind drifted to the memory of his father, the last time they had stood in front of that cabin together, when his father had said, "This is yours, son. It'll always be here." Mark took a slow breath, pulled out his phone, and called his lawyer. Later that day, sitting in the lawyer's office, Mark placed everything on the table: the property deed, survey maps, HOA bylaws, and every fake notice Richard had ever sent. And finally, he showed the security camera footage from his own house. Footage recorded at 2 in the morning clearly showed Richard, along with 2 other men, installing the fence and laying down the spike strips. The lawyer watched the video carefully, leaned back in his chair, and said calmly, "Richard just made the biggest mistake of his life." That same evening, 3 things happened. A police report was filed for criminal trespassing and property tampering. The video footage and documentation were sent to the HOA's main governing board, and a civil lawsuit was filed in court. Richard still had absolutely no idea what was coming. Within the first 12 hours, police officers knocked on Richard's front door. He stood there in his usual suit and said confidently, "I'm an HOA board member. I know the law." The officer looked at him and replied, "Great, then you can explain it tomorrow morning at the station." During the next 12 hours, the HOA governing board reviewed the video footage. Then they started investigating Richard's past records. What they discovered shocked them. Richard had been filing falsified documents under the authority of his HOA position, not just against Mark, but against several other neighbors who had quietly accepted his decisions without challenging them. The board immediately called an emergency meeting. By the end of it, Richard was removed from the HOA committee completely. The power he had used to intimidate people for years was suddenly gone. Then the court issued its order. The fence and spike strips had to be removed immediately. Richard was ordered to pay damages to Mark and appear in court. Even Richard's own lawyer pulled him aside and told him the truth. "You're going to lose this case, and the penalty will be serious." But that still wasn't the worst part. While the HOA board was reviewing Richard's records, they also examined his property documents. What they found had nothing to do with Mark at all. Richard had missed 6 consecutive mortgage payments on his home. The bank had already started foreclosure proceedings quietly months earlier. The investigation, the legal case, and the public attention surrounding Richard pushed the situation into the spotlight, and that final step the bank needed. It happened immediately. Before those 48 hours were even over, a notice appeared on Richard's own front door. It came from the bank and read, "You have 30 days to vacate the property. The man who tried to take someone else's cabin ended up losing his own house." The next morning, Mark walked back to the cabin. He opened the door and stepped inside. His hand slowly ran across the wooden wall his father had built years ago. His eyes filled with emotion, and he stood there quietly for a moment. Then he locked the cabin again, walked back into his home, and made himself a fresh cup of coffee. Richard, somewhere in a rented room, was probably still replaying that night in his mind, wondering why he ever looked at that cabin in the first place. And that's what this story really shows. Power, influence, titles, suits, none of it matters when the truth is on the other side. Mark never shouted. He never fought. He simply picked up the phone and let the law do what it was meant to do. Patience and truth don't make noise. They don't need to. They just win. If this story meant something to you, drop a like. It genuinely helps more than you think. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were in Mark's place? Subscribe so you don't miss the next story, because the next one is even more unbelievable. Until then, take care of yourself.